welcome to the Castle Talk podcast, where we talk to writers and creators of today's genre worlds from Denver, Colorado. I'm your host, Jason Henderson, co-author of the new book, California Tiki, from the History Press. This month, tonight, Boaz Yakin is an American screenwriter, film director, and producer based in New York. He's penned the screenplays to films like The Rookie, A Price Above Rubies, Prince of Persia, The Sands of Time. He's directed the 2000 sports drama Remember the Titans, the Jason Statham action film Safe, and he was the executive producer for the first two entries in the Hostel franchise. That is a heck of a resume. Welcome, Boaz.
Thank you very much. Glad to be here.
I'm extremely excited to talk. The new movie is Boarding School. That's what we're talking about, the one that's coming out actually at the end of August, the end of this August. And the film is Boarding School. Very briefly, it reminds me of the kinds of thrillers that I love to read, decades ago, like Lois Duncan kind of thrillers. Can you tell us what happens in Boarding School? Like, what's the elevator pitch?
Well, I mean, without talking about the plot necessarily too much, it's about a young Jewish boy living in New York in the 90s who is basically, it's not a ghost story of any sort, but he's visited by his grandmother, who's never been allowed to meet her spirit in some way, and learns the next day that she passed away the night before. And essentially, he comes to understand that she was a Holocaust survivor who probably did something pretty horrible to survive the war, and he becomes kind of obsessed with her clothing and her persona, and he gets sent away to this bizarre, quote-unquote, boarding school in the middle of nowhere where he has to contend with some very strange and intense goings on. So that's, on a plot level, that's sort of where the movie lies.
So, and that shows up a lot in the trailer. You have Will Patton shows up and says, "Oh, you've been selected to come to this very selective school in the middle of nowhere." And it turns out that things aren't as they seem when we get there. I mean, what did you have any models in mind for the story? Like anything that you wanted to bring to mind when people would watch it?
Well, story-wise, I would say that it really came from a very strong personal place in terms of a story that deals with essentially trying to own and embrace the things that we often feel make us most ashamed or that we have most trouble with in ourselves. In this particular case, his own inner femininity, his own inner sense of his ethnicity that the kid never really understood and came to terms with. It's about embracing the things often that we're ashamed of that we think make us weak, but actually make us strong. That's what the movie's about. In terms of influences and so on, there weren't that many on the script, but as a film or as a movie, I should say, it kind of falls right between genres. It's in the horror genre, but more the way, say, Charles Laughton's Night of the Hunter is, or David Lynch's Blue Velvet is. Like, movies that have what you'd call horror elements or really intense kind of thriller elements, but they don't exactly fit into the horror model necessarily. And, Pedro Almodovar's Under the Skin or Eyes Without a Face, movies that have shocking moments and intense violence and things like that, but aren't necessarily what you'd call a horror movie. Those were things that influenced this thing.
Were you thinking of, and I love that you would mention Eyes Without a Face. I mean, that's a wonderful read. You're talking about this boy coming to terms with his own femininity, but also these things that he didn't know just about his own heritage. Were you thinking about deprogramming kind of stuff that is in the news from time to time? How we now know this is a terrible abuse, but it was definitely something that was happening in the 1990s where people would be
I wasn't thinking about it really from a strong social, like a social political perspective. It really came much more from the personal, it's very much a Holocaust movie in its own way, really more than anything. And, I grew up in in a very Orthodox Jewish environment, and my entire, my mother's side of the family, which was Polish Jews, were all killed in the Holocaust, only her dad and mom lived because they were in Palestine at the time. And yet as a kid, there was this, I had this intense feeling of shame that my family were victims, and I think that Jews who not who are not Israeli Jews, basically, but Jews that grow up in what we call the diaspora and so on. There's this, culture of victimhood and this sense of shame about the fact that your people were basically victimized, and so you feel a sense of weakness and when you identify with that part of your identity, and so for me it was a very personal thing about having to overcome a sense of shame in your past, things that you don't even know happened necessarily, but that you sense through your parents and through your environment, things people haven't really been talking to you about, but that are just there in the air, and about having to embrace that side of your identity and use it as a place of strength rather than as a place of weakness. That's a lot more where this came from, rather than a kind of a more overtly political perspective.
You use the word shame, which strikes me as such a surprising word. To think about, like, my family was victimized, right? And the first word that doesn't pop to mind would be ashamed. I mean, I can imagine things like, deep sadness and anger. But I believe you, and I find it believable, but it's surprising. It's not something I would think of first. The idea of being ashamed of what happened to you, being ashamed of victimhood. That's
I think being ashamed of victimhood is a very common thing. How could we let this happen to me? We must have been weak. We must have been pathetic. Yeah. You know what I mean? And I think that's something that we grow up with often, and it's something that I guess on some level I was trying to show an exorcism of that feeling in this movie.
Yeah, I like that subtext. That makes me very, very interested in this. I was just looking at the other day. We were writing about surfing. Are you familiar with Gidget, like the 1950s Gidget phenomenon of the girl who's a surfer and all that stuff? Well, what's interesting and what never comes up in those movies is if you go back to the original book, the 1957 book Gidget, it was by a guy named Frederick Kohner, who had actually fled the Holocaust, come to the United States. His daughter was a baby at the time. And she grew up I guess you'd say a first-generation immigrant, part of the diaspora in Los Angeles. Her dad is a screenwriter. And she, at 15, becomes one of the first major female surfers. And to me, there's such a subtext of this girl who fled the Holocaust, whose family is becoming a part of this growing, Hollywood and all that stuff. And the Jewishness is sucked right out of it in like the Hollywood version.
In those days, you really had to read between the lines on that.
Yeah. So it's really interesting to me to hear you talk about like hitting some of those notes head on and really looking at them. That sounds really fascinating as a thriller. Can you tell us a little bit about who's in the movie and I want to know who's in it and where did you actually put this one together? Where did you shoot it?
Well, we shot the movie in New York, just found this kind of incredible mansion upstate, just a little bit, just an hour out of the city, not even. It stars Will Patton. I guess he's the main antagonist, if you want to call it that. It's kind of hard to know where he fits in, but he's a great character actor, and an amazing performer. And he gives a very strange and off-kilter and I think original performance for a character like this. So that was a pleasure. And then it was actually the lead is played by someone called Luke Prael, a young guy who this is really his first feature. He just was in a movie called Eighth Grade that people are watching and are into. But this was his first feature, and it was kind of interesting. The two leads are him and a young actress called Sterling Jerins, who, at the age of 12 when we made this film, she had already done more films than I have. But we didn't know it at the time that we cast them. But we cast them separately, meaning we did audition them together and everything. And they said they knew each other, and I thought it was from auditions or school or something. But it turns out that they've been best friends since childhood. That their parents were best friends. Wow. That their older siblings were best friends, and their parents actually had them so that they could have kids at the same time. And so they grew up in each other's houses. And I had no idea of that when I cast. And it made what was actually a pretty emotionally challenging performance for Luke, the boy, who has to do a lot of really intense things and, has to wear a dress and know that in the high school was going to see him running around in a dress all day. It was really great for him to have his best friend there, basically able to like prop him up and give him support. So that worked out really well.
Wow, that's really wonderful. So the movie comes out, and I just want to say, looking at the trailer looks fantastic. Like you said, you shot it in this practical mansion, which is, it looks fantastic.
Thank you.
So I think it's very exciting. The movie comes out at the end of the month, and I really hope that people go out to see it, especially because of the things you've been telling me about how it is a different sort of thriller. Yeah. So thanks a lot. Boaz Yakin, Boarding School is the film. I hope people check it out. And I'll be sending you this article when it goes up.
Awesome. Thanks very much. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. Have a lovely evening.
Bye. Good night.
Bye, guys.